I'm going to be talking to Professor Max Auffhammer from the Haas Energy Institute at the University of California at Berkeley about a paper that he recently co-authored with some of his fellow economists about electrifying big rigs. And that's a big issue that we don't talk about a lot when it comes to climate change and lowering GHG emissions. So welcome to the interview, Max.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, look, why don't we start with an overview of your paper, please?
All right, so this is an exciting exercise, highly interdisciplinary. We had a computer scientist, an engineer, a life cycle modeler, and an economist on this paper, because this is a big question, right? So when we're thinking about the US freight sector, people don't really think about the trucks that ship their stuff around. So there's loads of trucks driving around the country. Sometimes when you're out in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, Nebraska, you see these long distance trucks, but trucks ship stuff from Boston to LA, but they also ship stuff from, Sacramento to Oakland and from Oakland inland. So 73% of the US freight by value is shipped by truck. About 42% of weight, which we call payload weight distance, is also shipped by truck. And there's roughly 2 million truck drivers in the United States. So it's a significant sector and source of employment. So the question we asked and in a meeting and never got an answer to because nobody had written a paper about it is, what if you could snap your fingers and turn the US freight sector into a fully electrified system, meaning no longer diesel trucks that when they drive by, your kids go, "Ooh, Dad, that smells bad," but a nice, quiet electric truck that has no local air pollution emissions where the truck drives, but is powered. You plug it in the wall like you do your Tesla or whatever other plug-in you have. It charges a big battery on the back of the truck, and off we go. So this, as I often do, simple question, turns out the answer is very complicated. If you plug in a truck, electricity isn't generated by unicorns on treadmills, right? Currently, it's generated by power plants that, emit lots of pollution, some coal, some natural gas, also, of course, solar and wind and hydro, for example. So you've got to figure out, where does that electricity come from? How's it generated? And then you've got to think a little bit about, what happens to the pollution, right? So once I charge a truck, the pollution no longer comes out of the tailpipe, it comes out of the power plant. So you've got to figure out, where are the power plants? Now, because the trucking sector is so big, this is no longer sort of a drop in an ocean, right? Where, adding one truck or charging an iPhone in the electricity system doesn't make a difference. If you all of a sudden charge all trucks, the overall electricity load in the system goes up quite significantly. So in addition to charging our cell phones and so on, you're going to have to generate, significant amounts of electricity. So we thought about that part as well.
I'm kind of curious, how much extra electricity would all those electric big rigs consume?
So, that's again, a fantastic question. The question here, the answer to that question is twofold. One, if we just assume there are roughly as many, trucks out there today as they were, in the counterfactual future, if the number of trucks is held constant, many assumptions go in 5%, 6, 7%, something like that. If we run the model different ways, the numbers are a little bit higher, a little bit lower. But the much bigger question, and I'm the annoying economist, the least favorite person at any party usually, isn't so much holding the fleet constant, but demand for freight is going up over time. So we're going to ship more parcels and more freight around. We're thinking this might go up by 10, 15, 20% over the next 20 years because we're all ordering stuff from Amazon is one point. So that number might go up quite a bit if we have more trucks on the road than we do today.
So my understanding is the paper looked at the amount of the health and climate impacts as the fleet is now, if the fleet were 100% electric, and then if the fleet were comprised of modern diesel trucks that have pollution controls and so on. And what were some of the conclusions you came to?
So they were surprising to me, frankly, but often when you ask questions you don't know the answer to, which are the most interesting question, right? Does it go up? Does it go down? When we compare the emissions from a future fleet of what will by then be cleaner diesel trucks, right? You can't just hold time constant and compare clean electric trucks to current day dirty diesel trucks. We let the diesel trucks get cleaner too. If you assume the current electric grid, having electric trucks out there is actually worse than having a cleaner set of diesel trucks out on the road. And that simply comes from the fact that outside of California and a couple of other bright spots in the United States, the grid is still relatively dirty, right? We use, some coal, less so, but still a lot of natural gas, which produces a bunch of, local pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions. However, again, not a fair comparison, right? Open the newspaper any day, President Biden and his team, as well as, Governor Newsom and his team, they're all pushing really hard to clean up the grid. So the other thing we did in the paper is we assumed a very optimistic grid, 80% renewables, right? People are going to grumble and say, it's got to be 100% renewables. 100% is hard. Let's go 80%. And we compare the impacts of that 80% renewable grid to a fleet of diesel trucks. And what we get there, which is not that surprising, is that an electric fleet is much cleaner. So the conclusion there is pretty simple. You can't just clean up the trucks. You've also got to clean up the system that you charge the trucks from.
What are the policy implications here, Max? Because as you say, President Biden and many of the state governors are talking about a clean grid by 2035 or maybe 2040, somewhere in around that. So that process is already underway, varying degrees. So what other policy implications are there, both at the federal level and at the state level?
So I think there's a couple of really interesting ones in there. One is we can show, and we have lots of cool looking maps, even for scientist standards, the maps look cool on the paper. We can show you which areas have the sort of big benefits from cleaning up, right? Trucks go on highways mostly, and those highways much of the time go through low-income neighborhoods. In California, we've got a classification for disadvantaged communities. So we see a lot of the local pollution from trucks ending up in the lungs of low-income communities and folks living there. So the first thing to show is that there's not just this, less overall pollution, but you clean up trucks, you're also going to deal with what we call an environmental justice issue, that the pollution isn't equally distributed across individuals. Max, who lives in a very nice, wealthy neighborhood, has much less pollution ending up in his lungs than his graduate student who might live in West Oakland or somewhere like that. So that's the first one. There's the secondary effect. The big one to me is it just adds further emphasis on this pressure to really clean up the grid in the background. This is, again, not news to the folks working on this, but you can't just electrify end uses and declare victory. You can electrify end uses, think trucking, think personal transport, but also heating, water heating, things like that. But it won't work unless the grid charging these devices or powering these electric devices is also cleaned up. So it just adds further urgency to this notion of let's clean up the grid. Last point, and then I'll stop, is batteries are super heavy. In different research, I've shown with my co-author, Mike Anderson, that if you get hit by a car that's a ton heavier than some counterfactual car, you're more likely to die in a vehicle-on-vehicle collision. So there is this notion that electric vehicles and trucks, because the batteries are so heavy, are often heavier than their internal combustion engine counterparts. So I think there's a science component here too, where we should focus quite a bit on worrying about the weight of batteries, not in the sense of let's not use batteries, but in the sense of let's really push the science on how to lightweight batteries and lightweight vehicles to do away with this issue of vehicle weight, which is, not good for society.
Max, thank you very much. Always appreciate your insights.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is such a great contribution to the educational sector. So I really enjoy using your videos.